Welcome to the Rotary Club of York. We are a people of action committed to service above self and honoring the four-way test. Steve Feldman will lead us in our opening song, America the Beautiful, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Eric Chase will provide the invocation, and Ellie Williams will introduce our visiting Rotarians and guests.
As it is July 14th, we had a lot of fun speculating on whether I would sing La Marseillaise, but we decided you did not want to hear me sing in French. So please join me in America the Beautiful. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If you would prepare yourself for prayer in the way you are most accustomed. Thank you, Creator God, for the gift of Rotary and each one gathered here and virtually today. We ask blessings on this food and the hands that have prepared it, as we use it to nourish our bodies and our minds to continue to be servant leaders. May we be ever mindful of those in need in our community and world, and help us to provide food to the hungry, to heal the wounds of the hatred with love, comfort those in sorrow, and bring peace to those living in areas of unrest in our world. We ask for blessings on our speaker as he shares about our role as world citizens and our relationship with China in this new world order. And for all this we pray, amen.
Hi there, I'm here to welcome our guests today. Happy that everyone is here to join us and enjoy today's presentation and speaker, and we hope that you join us again in the future. When I call your name, please stand and remain standing, and we'll hold our applause until the end of my little list here, and then President Jackie will greet our guests. So for visiting Rotarians, we have Charlie Stein from York East and classification dentist. Guests of the Student Education Committee, Jasmine Cross, Tammy Cross, and Lincoln Cross, and Lindsey Hershner. Guests of Scott Moore, our speaker, Louise Bortner, and Sherry Moore.
Thank you so much to our guests and our visiting Rotarian for joining us today. We again hope you find this program to be meaningful and that you will plan to join us again very often. Rotarians, please help me welcome our guests. So I have a very important announcement to make. We've had a lot of question, a lot of feedback regarding the timing of our meetings. And as you know, we were able to pivot with the pandemic in providing a virtual opportunity to stay connected. And so we moved our time from starting to network at 11:30, and then 12 to 1 was our meeting online. But starting next week, we're going to return to some real normalcy here, as well as our hybrid opportunity online to attend the meetings. So next week we'll begin at 12:15. Lunch will start. You can come early if you want for the buffet, but we won't actually begin our meeting until 12:15, and then we'll stop at the original stop time that we used to do at 1:15 sharp. So that is our plan. Please be here next week. Plan to do it. And if you come early, that's absolutely fine. The buffet is ready and you'll have extra time to network, but we won't start the meeting until 12:15. It is with deep regret that we accept the resignations of two of our beloved longtime Rotarian members, Dan McGarry and Steve Klunk, and we wish them well in their retirement. And now for our member moment. Today's member moment features Karen McCormick. Where is Karen? There she is. Karen McCormick joined Rotary in 1999, the same year she became president and CEO of Wilmette Corporation. Her proposer was Dick Bricker, who served as vice president of the company, and he invited her to attend because he thought it would be a really great networking opportunity. She enjoyed the meeting very much, and she became a member because of the people that she met here and also because of the quality of the programs, which she says are better than she ever expected. Karen has been with Wilmette Corporation for 37 years. The company was founded in 1957 after Karen's uncle, Webb McCormick, read an article in Reader's Digest on the future of long-term nursing home care. Webb, along with Karen's father, Jim, and their brother-in-law, Dr. Ray Wilson, bought a share in Fairview Manor, where they began their quest to provide residents with the highest quality senior care delivered by the most qualified professionals. Today, they operate several skilled nursing care centers, retirement living communities, and personal care facilities. Karen lives, works, and plays in the city of York, and when she isn't in York, you can find her in the Caribbean at her beautiful seaside home in St. John. That's where she and her husband, Andy, were married 3.5 years ago on the beach in St. John. And incidentally, Karen has generously donated her home to the Love for Community Fall Fundraiser Auction for several years. And she's encouraging each of you who have that vacation getaway to consider donating to this very important signature event that we do each fall. That's a little plug for the fundraising committee and Dee and Darren. You're welcome. Karen lives life to the fullest. She loves adventure, taking advantage of unique opportunities, like the time she was visiting Wichita, Kansas, which was known as the air capital of the world. And while at brunch, she remarked to a group of people who work for Boeing, that sure was a beautiful day. And they replied, yes, a very good day for a jump. They went on to explain that they were headed to Soupyville to go skydiving. And Karen said, you know, that's on my bucket list. That's something I think I'd like to try one day. And they said, well, why not today? And so she accompanied them to the airfield, and not only did she tandem jump for the very first time out of an airplane, but she added a few theatrical backflips just for that added thrill. Karen is often the first person you see when you come up the stairs to Rotary, as she chairs the cashier and registration committee. So next week when you come to Rotary, be sure to stop and say hello. And now to present two non-traditional student scholarships is our very own dynamic Diane Marino.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, I just want to give a big shout out to everyone sitting in this room and everyone that's joining us virtually. These scholarships would never be possible without your generous support. Fred Rosenmiller, a special thank you to you. The funds that you have given in the Legacy program have gone directly to these students today, and I cannot thank you enough. So big round of applause for everyone, please. It's also a great honor chairing this committee. You get to meet such wonderful, wonderful young people that you know are going to make a huge difference in this world today. So without any more dramatics from me, let me proceed with the first, Miss Jasmine Cross. Jasmine is a 2016 graduate of Red Lion Area High School. She took a year off, not quite sure what she wanted to do, as maybe I probably should have done that too. And then after 1 year off, it turned into a few more years off because the bills started to add up and she had to work full time to figure out how she's going to pay for everything. But then she realized what she wanted to do. So she is working towards a bachelor's degree in psychology. She started at HAC and has recently transferred to Penn State York. She currently works full-time as a behavioral health technician, and that is what she's hoping to get a degree in. And she is hoping to graduate in May of 2024. So congratulations, Jasmine. It's my honor to present you with this check for $2,400 to help with your education.
I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you for recognizing me today. It's not easy to work full time and go to school year round. So thank you so much. You helped made me have a step closer. Thank you.
And then next we have Lindsey Hershner. Come on up, Lindsey. Lindsey opened her own salon right after graduation, which she still currently operates and works full time. She is also going to school on a part-time basis to HAC in York. She is studying nursing and hoping to graduate in December of 22. She is a graduate of Kennerdale High School. Not only does she operate and own on a full-time basis a hair salon, and she goes to school full-time or part-time for nursing, but she also has 2 young boys, ages 5 and 10. So congratulations to Lindsey. You've got your work cut out for you. And I would also like to congratulate you and honored to present you with $2,400 to help with your education.
I just wanted to also say thank you very quickly to everybody in the room. I was not aware of scholarships like this for non-traditional students. So as a parent and someone who owns a business full time, I really appreciate all the help, and I look forward to continuing my education in a new career and becoming a nurse, hopefully soon. Thank you.
Congratulations, Jasmine and Lindsey. Well done. We wish you all the best in your future success. We know that you have very bright futures and you're going very far. Congratulations again. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce past District Governor Ben Hoover, who will introduce our program.
Thank you, President Jackie. It is my pleasure to again introduce Dr. Scott Michael Moore. He spoke to us on February 26, 2020, just before we shut down. Scott was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and graduated from high school at the United World College of Hong Kong. He entered Princeton University, graduating with an AB degree in Public and International Affairs, summa cum laude, with certificates in environmental studies and Chinese language and culture in 2008. He spent a year at Peking University as a Fulbright scholar studying environmental economics and policy, and then was awarded one of the 32 Rhodes Scholarships to study at Oxford University, earning his Master of Science degree with distinction in environmental change and management in 2010, and stayed on to earn his PhD in politics in 2013. Next, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, worked for the State Department in the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs, and then for the World Bank as a water resources management specialist, and co-led a study of China's water sector. Since 2018, he has been at the University of Pennsylvania and is the director of the China programs and strategic initiatives. His 3 pages of publications include pieces for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. His new book, Rethinking China's Rise, New Ways to Compete and Cooperate on the Environment, Technology, and Beyond, is scheduled to be published by the Oxford University Press early next year. Please welcome back Scott Moore. Scott.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, and thanks to you all for being here and having me back. As Dr. Cooper mentioned, I was with you last February, fairly shortly before the world came to a stop. I had actually just before that been in China, and although I spoke to you about a different topic last year, I thought it might be appropriate to come back and to speak to you about what I see as the future of U.S.-China relations, because I do deeply believe that as we come out of the pandemic, the single biggest challenge on the world stage, at least for our country and for many other countries as well, is how to handle relations with China that have become much more complex in recent years and yet have become more important than ever, in large part actually because of some of the issues that I spoke to you about last time, especially involving climate change. Before I just sort of dive in, I also did want to just sort of recognize and congratulate the scholarship recipients and add my congratulations to you both. Very inspiring stories. And so congratulations again. So I want to hopefully do kind of 3 things today. First of all, to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the kind of features of contemporary China, the way it's developed and grown over the last decade or two, and how I think that frames the sort of difficulties for us as a country, the United States, and then for the world a little bit more generally, to focus for a few minutes specifically on technology, which I think is really increasingly central both to the issues and complexities that we have with China, as well as to the need for cooperation. And then finally, to talk about what I think are some of the really deep challenges that are going to really sort of make this a thorny problem for the foreseeable future. And I think the kind of takeaway message that I would bring to everyone is that China is increasingly a central player in the big challenges that we face, again, not just as a country, but as a world, especially in terms of the environment and also technology. And yet there are several kind of features of China's policy and strategy that make it really difficult to envision cooperating very effectively. And so I think we have to think about different ways to pursue shared challenges. And I think that has to involve more competition than cooperation. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. I wanted to just kind of start by putting things in very kind of big picture context and putting China's rise as an economic power in very long-term historical perspective. This graph over here shows, as best as we can estimate, the share of the total world economy that different countries and regions have made up over the last 1,000 years. And again, as best anybody can tell. And China is the red kind of portion here. And there are 2 things to kind of take away from this graph. One is that as recently as around 1820, this was roughly the time of the Opium Wars in the early 19th century, China was the largest economy in the world, had the largest single share of global economic activity. And it was really only since then, in the decades after that, that China really started to shrink to a fairly small portion of the world economy. And this is also the period when the United States became the world's single largest economy. And of course, you had major growth among the major European countries as well. The second thing, though, and one thing to kind of note about this share is going to keep increasing for the foreseeable future. So that sometime, probably this decade, but certainly early in the next, China will become the largest economy in the world, and will kind of start to approach back where it was for most of prehistory or ancient history, depending on how you look at it, in terms of accounting for somewhere between 25 and 30% of the total world economy. But the second thing to appreciate about this graph is that if you go back before, this is sort of roughly the Industrial Revolution period right here. And this is the period where you start to see a divergence between the sheer number of people and the link to economic activity. So if you go back, into sort of deep, sort of ancient history period here, there's basically a direct relationship between number of people and economic activity. The more people you have, the bigger the share of the world economy you have. Because of the Industrial Revolution, you start to kind of decouple that so that each individual person can be much more productive. And as a result, you have countries that are more industrialized, like the United States, like European countries, that are able to take a bigger chunk of the world economy. And the implication here is that even though China is going to become the world's largest economy, and this kind of share is going to keep growing into the future, that doesn't mean that on an individual basis or a per capita basis, China is going to be more productive. In fact, there's really no point in the foreseeable future where China will surpass the US or many other developed countries in terms of per person economic output. So it's really important to keep in mind when we think about China and its economic rise, the difference between absolute and relative standards, whether you're talking about the sum total or a per person on a per person basis. The second thing about China's economic rise that's really important to keep in mind is it's almost all about trade. So what this graph shows, and I apologize, this is a little hard to read on this screen. But this starts in 1960 and goes up to about 2017. And what you can see is basically China had almost no exports. This is exports. Almost no exports until the late 80s. You start to see a slight increase, fairly dramatic increase in the 1990s. But then after China entered the World Trade Organization in 2003, you see near exponential growth in exports. The only major interruption was around the 2008 financial crisis. This is basically how China became wealthy. This is how China became the largest, or became on the path to becoming the largest economy in the world. It's through free trade and capturing gains from free trade. There are two things to be said about this phenomenon, this feature of China's rise. First of all, until pretty recently, there was a consensus that it worked pretty well for everyone. The location of or concentration of manufacturing in China produced a lot of gains for Western and developed country exporters, not just American, but European, Japanese, et cetera. Consumers also, for the most part, benefited because in most areas, the concentration of these manufacturing goods and networks and sectors in China allowed for big economies of scale to be generated, lowering the cost of production for most goods, meaning you could buy more things more cheaply than just about ever before. Pretty soon after this graph kind of stops, though, around 2017, that consensus really started to shift. And of course, it had started to change a little bit before then, too. But you started to get a lot of concern from American and European and Japanese companies about whether this phenomenon, whether this massive and sort of continuous growth in trade was really in their interest. You started to hear a lot more concerns from companies about market access, where the volume of exports that was coming from China, was that equaled by an opportunity for imports and for sales of goods and services to the Chinese market? Was this trade fair, so to speak? And that really is a lot of the basis for some of the concerns and tensions that we've seen in recent years. So this graph kind of both shows the driving force behind China's rise in many respects, but it also planted the seeds of a lot of the conflict and tension that we now have. And of course, the 2017 is also right about when the Trump administration came in and launched a lot of a review of trade, China trade policy that ended up leading to the trade war. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. In the meantime, though, what this massive growth led to is China becoming a powerhouse in by almost any measure or metric. The world's second largest economy, second largest military budget behind the United States, largest consumer market, largest oil importer, largest source of tourists, largest trading partner for 40 countries. That's 10 more than the United States, and the dominant player in lots and lots of sectors and industries: autos, fashion, food, you name it, entertainment. However, that doesn't tell the whole story, because usually many of you who are in business will know when you see growth like that. We like to see growth in sales and things like that have a curve like that, but it usually comes with some problems along with it. And that's certainly the case with China. One of the things that this growth came at the expense of is government spending. So particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of the growth that you saw in the decade or so following financial crisis was a result of a massive stimulus that the Chinese government embarked upon, effectively buying the growth that followed the 2008 financial crisis through deficit spending. And so you had a huge increase in government debt from the early sort of 2010s to the late 2010s. Now, that's not necessarily, in the case of China, all that serious, because China's economy grew so fast that it absorbed a lot of that deficit spending. But what it did mean is that the government was left with relatively few tools kind of left in its arsenal, so to speak. And you actually saw that with the pandemic, in response to the pandemic, where China adopted only a very limited stimulus, much lower scale than the one that we have adopted here in the US. And in part, that was because they had a very high debt burden and really couldn't afford to. Second, demographics. China's society is facing a really interesting demographic challenge. Typically, what you see in other countries around the world is that as countries get richer, birth rates fall, and you lead to issues that we're sort of familiar with here in the U.S. when we talk about Social Security. Certainly is familiar to countries like Japan or Germany, where you have a relatively small number of younger people who are in the workforce, and then a relatively large number of retirees, and that creates a significant kind of economic and fiscal issue. China is unusual in facing that same situation, but at a much, much lower level of wealth, essentially, particularly per capita wealth. And so starting probably sometime next decade, China's population will start falling by several million people a year. And that's a very unusual problem for a developing country to have. Most developing countries have positive population growth. In addition to that, China has a number of really serious social problems. Actually pretty low levels of education, which is interesting because, we're certainly used to seeing and hearing about really high performing Chinese school systems and educational systems, but that's really only true in the wealthy big cities. Elsewhere, the education system is very unequal. And if you sort of look at the average numbers of schooling that exist across China, it's only about 8.5. In comparison, Korea, that's what ROK refers to, at a comparable stage of its development in Korea, the figure was around 11, so significantly higher. And as you have an economy that grows in sophistication, this becomes more of a problem because you need higher levels of education to kind of keep climbing the economic development ladder. You start to get into industries and skills where you need higher levels of education to be employable. That problem also kind of runs head on into a number of other challenges that, again, are sort of we're used to thinking about in countries like the US, but are not very common in other developing countries, one of which is automation. China has tens of millions of jobs that are at risk from automation. Again, it's a challenge that we're kind of thinking about here in the U.S., economies like the U.S., that level of job displacement. But again, China is facing that same challenge at a much lower level of income per capita. Other challenges, China has an interestingly very high savings rate. And normally you would think of this as a good thing, but for sustainable economic growth, it's actually not necessarily a good thing because developed economies like the US, like Europe, tend to rely mostly on consumer spending and on business investment as the main drivers of economic growth. When you have a really high household savings rate, that tends to depress consumer spending. They're sort of one-for-one equivalent. And this savings rate has been going down over time, but it's remained persistently high for a lot of kind of interesting reasons, which I won't go into now. But this is actually a significant barrier for China, particularly as it comes out of the pandemic and particularly as other countries like the US have put in place trade restrictions that limit that exponential growth in exports. It's going to have to look somewhere else for growth. And the biggest, most promising place to look is consumer spending. And that high household savings rate kind of stands in the way of that. Last thing I'll mention in terms of challenges, but it's very significant, and I'll come back to at the end, is basically internal divisions. You know, to the extent that we sort of think about China, see it in the media, it's usually portrayed as a very kind of powerful, you know, single country. But the reality is that China is a deeply divided country politically. Taiwan is, you know, functionally independent. Hong Kong, until recently, and I'll come back with that, had its own political system. Obviously, used to be under the British until 1997, when it reverted to Hong Kong. And you see that reflected in some really interesting polling measures. Here's a poll from 2019 that less than 20% of younger Hong Kongers saw themselves as Chinese. They saw themselves as either kind of a distinct Hong Kong identity or something else. That's a real problem politically for the Chinese leadership, to try to think about how you deal with this lack of a kind of common sense of national unity. I'm going to kind of move more quickly through the next couple slides, but just to kind of say that another kind of facet of this dramatic increase in China's economic wealth and its influence has been to strengthen a political system and an economic system that just looks very different to ours. As you all know, China is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, which is a one-party system. And the thing about that is that has sort of a number of quirks and causes a lot of, often causes a lot of confusion, is that China sort of has effectively a dual political system. So there's like the state, as we're used to thinking about it, the judiciary, the legislature, the executive. But then there's a kind of parallel Communist Party system that sort of has an equivalent for almost every major state unit. And in most cases, it's the party system that really kind of controls things and drives things. And this has been something that, particularly in US government statements and policy, a lot more attention has been paid to over the last couple of years, because the sort of feeling is that, okay, you know, you sort of hear something from the government of China, but does that mean that the Communist Party kind of will go along with it or agree to it? Or conversely, where does the kind of party start and the state begin? Because, you know, we don't like the fact that the party controls China as an authoritarian regime or system. One thing I do want to point out that is significant here, and a particularly important quirk of this kind of dual parallel system, China's army is actually not directly accountable to the government. It's accountable to the party. So strictly speaking, it's an armed wing of the party, which is very different to how we're used to thinking about a military. And so when you get into thinking about, you know, kind of geopolitical issues or security issues, that's a very significant difference in our two systems. I'm going to just sort of not say too much about this slide. It's a pretty wordy slide, but just to say that an important trend over the last few years has been that the Communist Party, as part of its kind of authoritarian approach to ruling China as a one-party state, has relied more heavily on nationalism and on ideology that is in many ways kind of anti-foreign. And that's another important element of why relations with China have become so rocky. It started to rely on a very sort of uncompromising and in many ways anti-foreign stance. Could certainly say more about that. Another aspect of this that I think is particularly important to the US business community is that China has a very large state-owned sector, meaning companies or enterprises that are directly controlled by or linked to the state and or the party. And typically it's both, as I can go into. Two things to say about that. One, the state-owned sector has been decreasing in size over time. I mean, if you go back to 1979, when the Chinese economy first opened, virtually 100% state-owned. Since then, the percentage of total economic assets has continued to decrease. Today, it's around 35%. So a minority, but that's still a really large chunk of the economy, far larger than would be the case in the US or most Western economies. Still accounts for a pretty big chunk of employment, around 20-25% of total employment, also extremely inefficient. So if you look at, for example, debt to equity leverage ratios, state-owned enterprises have performed far worse than private companies. Same in terms of return on assets. So this is all to say you've got a really huge chunk of the economy that's pretty inefficient and performs pretty poorly. It's also, generally speaking, not great for foreign competition. So if you're a foreign company and you're trying to compete in the Chinese market, state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies are often a significant barrier to doing that, and it create a significant distortion in the economy. All of this has been kind of paralleled by a pretty dramatic shift in US public opinion. And actually, I'd be really interested to just hear what opinions are here in the room, but the national opinion polls say that China has been viewed increasingly unfavorably. It's been net favorability has been sort of underwater since around 2012 or so, but it's increased very significantly again since around 2017. It's now a solid 2/3 or so negative perception. And this is similar views, actually, if not even more so, across most Western and developed countries. So this is true in Japan, across most of Europe. The only exceptions are Latin America and Africa, where typically China is viewed more favorably than unfavorably. I'm actually going to skip the next few slides just for the sake of time, but these are all slides from this trip that I took to China back in early 2020, and they're all, it was focused on visiting Chinese tech firms, which was a really interesting exercise. And really, this slide is just to say that, we sometimes think of China as a country that's perhaps in some ways less developed than the US or other countries, but there are certainly some sectors and areas in which it's more advanced, and one of those is mobile payments. So this graph shows the increase in usage of a mobile payment platform embedded in an app called WeChat. If any of you have been to China in the last couple of years, spent any length of time there, you may have downloaded and used WeChat. Everyone has a WeChat account. It's used for everything, used for purchases, used for chat communication, just about anything you can use it for. This is the inside, the headquarters of Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant. It looks like Versailles. It was built just a few years ago, but looks like a European palace. Very strange. And just a few seconds after I took this picture, someone came over to me and told me I wasn't allowed to take pictures. But I think what it shows is another interesting facet of China's growth and development, where almost for the first time, you have very large and in some ways world-class Chinese firms that are competing in cutting-edge technology areas. So Huawei is best known for providing 5th-generation telecom equipment. So this is, if any of you on your cell phones have like 5GE that comes up, 5G is the kind of next generation cell phone sort of technology network. At the moment, Huawei is one of the leading technology providers worldwide. And this is kind of new, that Chinese companies like Huawei with headquarters that look like this are playing such an important role in cutting edge technology areas. This is just a brief little aside. Another thing that's significant about China is that it actually has significant innovation ecosystem. So in the US, we're used to thinking about places like Silicon Valley as being the sort of, the poster child for how you do innovation. You have this cluster of brilliant creative people, financing, technology firms that drive innovation. China has those clusters too, at a lesser scale and less productive overall, but they exist. And the leading one is probably centered on the city of Shenzhen, which is right across the border from Hong Kong. And I just wanted to show you this slide from, this is a visit to like an incubator in Shenzhen. This is the slide they put up for visitors. And I just think it's sort of an interesting illustration of the thinking. It's, if you can't see it well, it says industry has been migrating engineering talents and ecosystem follows it from the UK to the US and now to Asia. This is kind of the vision for how innovation happens. It used to happen mostly in the West and in the US, but in the future, it's going to happen increasingly in Asia and in places like Shenzhen. All of that technological investment and progress does have a dark side, especially with respect to pervasive surveillance. That's something you hear a lot about in the news, and it is true. This is a picture of just an average street corner in the city of Shenzhen. What you can't see in this picture is the integration of things like facial recognition software that would allow the cameras here to be able to pretty precisely track any individual that these cameras see walking on the street and identify lots of different details about them. Now, I should point out, China's not the only country to have systems like this. The UK also has a pretty sophisticated network of CCTV cameras, for example. But China has kind of taken this to a whole new level in terms of individual surveillance of individuals in everyday life. It's also a little bit unique in the way in which there's this link to kind of propaganda and ideology. This is an image from a public park. You can see there the pervasive surveillance cameras. You can also kind of see in the distance this sign. And what this sign says is it's the core socialist values. It's propaganda. It's a propaganda kind of installation. And as a quick side note, I found it interesting over the last few years, at least in the major cities that I've visited, city officials seem to have gone on a park building binge. I'm not sure why. These new beautiful parks are growing up all over the place. They all have these propaganda installations. And in fact, this park, I didn't take a picture of it that I show here, although that would be good to add in the future. It actually has a whole kind of walkway that goes around a lake. And the walkway is dotted with these stations, each of which is a different historical moment in the development of the Chinese Communist Party. It's effectively a propaganda walk through recent Chinese history. So I think it's just sort of very interesting that there's this investment in creating public spaces, but it's always linked to government propaganda and to ideology. That's not, there is a sort of upside to some of the spread of this technology and innovation. This slide shows an NGO. And by the way, another thing that's sort of not widely known but important about contemporary China is that there is actually a very vibrant NGO sector. It's just subject to a lot of limits that we're not used to in a place like the US. But this NGO is using mobile app data to track pollution. So it's not that the kind of spread of technology and innovation is all bad, so to speak. There is kind of another side to it, so to speak. However, and this is the last kind of thing I wanted to say, something that has cropped up in the last 2 or 3 years, and that I think is probably the single biggest reason that relations with China have become so problematic, is that what used to be I should be careful how I say this. China has always been a country where human rights have been very problematic. That's always been a really significant source of tension in the US-China relationship, but it's gotten much, much worse over the last few years, mostly I would say because of actions on the Chinese side and intensifying human rights abuses. One example is Hong Kong. This is a photo from protests in Hong Kong in early 2020. So this was like maybe January 10th or something of 2020. Some of you may recall there were mass protests that started in 2019 in Hong Kong against the Beijing government and against the kind of union with Hong Kong. And you can see this character means revolution. There's this slogan up here is calling for universal suffrage. Hong Kong has never really had universal voting rights, even under the British, interestingly. And then this slogan is restore Hong Kong. The meaning is to free Hong Kong from Chinese rule. You can see why that might upset the government in Beijing, but maybe not as much as scenes like this. This is again another scene from a protest in early 2020. Really fascinating thing are the flags that you would see. You would very often see the U.S. flag. You would see the Taiwanese flag, the British flag, even the British colonial flag for Hong Kong. Anything but the Chinese flag. Again, you can see why that would make the Beijing government very nervous. And in fact, around this time last year, actually a little earlier, June, China passed a law called the National Security Law that effectively banned all forms of dissent and protest in Hong Kong. And I don't know, has anybody ever been to Hong Kong? I imagine several of you have. You'll recall it used to be more or less a free society, not unlike what the freedoms that we enjoy here. That's now totally gone, totally crushed. And it's actions like that that make it very, very difficult to contemplate cooperation on shared challenges as we move out of the pandemic. Another thing that has to bear mention here is the situation in Xinjiang, which is the northwest part of China. It's home to a population, a majority Muslim population of ethnic minorities known as the Uyghur. BuzzFeed News, which is an online news outlet, won the Pulitzer Prize just this past year, about a month ago, for reporting using images like this, which show the construction of large-scale internment camps, primarily to house members of the Uyghur minority who were accused of some form of radicalization or sort of terrorist activity. The more we learn about this, the worse it looks. Torture, forced sterilization, sort of many of the worst things that you could possibly imagine in terms of human rights abuses. That unfolding in such a kind of close proximity to the crushing of dissent in places like Hong Kong really deeply clouds the future of US-China relations and makes it very difficult to envision kind of a cooperative path going forward. However, none of that takes away from the shared challenges that we all face, like one area that I'm particularly interested in, climate change. Today, as you walked inside, you probably had some indication of the fact that this is one of the warmest summers on record. This is actually the third consecutive month in which temperature records have been broken for a lot of parts of the US, including the American West. You can see there a drought map from the month of May, but that roughly also correlates to temperature as well. We're not going to be able to do much of anything about climate change without China. China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. We absolutely need to work with China in some way to tackle climate change. But it's very, very difficult to imagine given these economic, trade, and human rights tensions. And I think the way forward that we have to think about it is more in terms of competition. So this is the last thing I'll say, when it comes to climate change, I think one thing that maybe we don't think enough about, we still need new technology to be able to tackle this problem. I'm driving over here, I saw a lot of solar panels, and every time I come over to this area, I see more. I love that. But the fact remains, we're still going to need some new technology to tackle this problem. And the first country to be able to develop that technology is really going to be able to gain a lot in terms of economic opportunities, jobs, energy security. And I think the competing to do that, competing and sort of engaging in a race to the top to develop those new technologies that's going to allow us to tackle this challenge of climate change is really where our focus is going to turn. And I think you're sort of seeing that in some of the things that the Biden administration is doing. But I'll stop there. And if we have a little bit of time, I apologize for talking so long, but if we have a little bit of time, I'd be happy to engage in some questions. And thank you again for having me. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I think the specific origins of COVID will ever be resolved.
Yeah. Thank you. For those on the joining virtually, the question was, do I think the origins of COVID will ever be definitively resolved? No, I don't. I mean, this is a highly specialized area, and so I hasten to add, there's a lot I don't know. I have an active text debate with some of my friends about this. I guess the one observation I would make is that most of the people I talk to who have some familiarity with China, or so-called sort of China hands, are convinced that there was a cover-up, that that there was some kind of accidental or deliberate step that Chinese authorities took that led to the spread of SARS-CoV-2. Almost all of the scientists that I know and public health experts are convinced that it was completely natural. And I think a lot of the reason for that is that the SARS virus, which is 96% genetically identical to the COVID-19 virus, we know came from bats, and then eventually jumped to humans through an interim, kind of animal. So the idea is that, well, if we know that this happened with a very, very similar virus, it seems very unlikely that there was some other process at work. Or in other words, we have a really good explanation for how this happens. But given that that's a lot of that's beyond my expertise, I think that's about the best answer I could offer you. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Yeah, thank you. And the question was, how much longer do I think Taiwan has? This is a question that every China kind of specialist is consumed by these days. And I do think, when you think about Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Macau was the other kind of colony that was absorbed back into China in 1999. So that's not really much of a concern at this point. And then there's Taiwan. And so it seems pretty clear that that's the next kind of point of conflict. So I don't have much to add to what U.S. military officials have said, which is that they think that probably a decade or so is when China would be in a position to militarily kind of retake Taiwan. So I don't have too much to add to that in terms of timeline. I think the only thing I would add is that that Taiwan plays such, it's sort of hard to describe how big a role Taiwan plays in the political mythology of the Chinese Communist Party. There's basically no room for error. Whatever China does with respect to Taiwan, it cannot fail. Because if it fails, or even if it were to take longer than expected to overrun Taiwan, for example, that could bring down the regime, in my opinion. So there's there's almost no room for error, whatever they do. I think we have a couple over here. Maybe sir in the front, and then I'll go to you.
Pointing out the number of dams that are being built in China along one or the other river, with a very sinister possibility of them stopping the water and causing all kinds of problems. What do you know about that?
Thank you for that question, which was what about the dams that China is building on its major rivers? And yeah, an interesting thing about China is that it kind of sits at the headwaters of most of the major Asian rivers. The Mekong, the Brahmaputra, which so the Mekong, as many of you have, anybody who's visited Southeast Asia probably knows, comes down through, forms the border between Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, exits through Vietnam, and really is sort of like the lifeline artery for inner Southeast Asia. Also, all of the Himalayan rivers, the Irrawaddy, the Brahmaputra that flow down through Myanmar, through India, through Bangladesh. China is the source of all those major rivers. They've been building a lot of very large dams on all of those rivers over the last few decades. I think the major concern is probably more environmental than political, so to speak. So it's very difficult and wouldn't make a lot of sense to actually use those dams to cut off the flow of water physically. When you have a dam that's on a major river, the purpose, like you wouldn't really build it except for the purpose of hydropower generation, which actually requires the water to flow through it. And even if you did for some reason want to keep the water behind the dam, you couldn't do that for very long because the sheer weight of the water would require you to release it. What you could do is you could impede the flow at times of year when it would be very bad for downstream countries to do that. So for example, if there was an extreme drought, you could keep more of the water behind the dam for a period of time and worsen the drought. But it's not really clear why, if you wanted to harm a country downstream, that wouldn't be the obvious way to do it. It would seem to be a lot easier to do things like do a boycott of imports or something like that. And in fact, China, Beijing hasn't been doing it as much lately, possibly just because of the pandemic, but for a while they had been doing things like stopping Chinese tourists from going to places like the Philippines in retaliation for positions that the Philippine government would take that Beijing didn't like. So those measures would probably be a lot easier to adopt if that was the intention. Oh yeah, sorry. Would it be possible if I took two questions at once? Would you mind? Okay, so sir, and then ma'am. Good question. That question was about whether TikTok and WeChat app data is being sort of archived or controlled. And then yes, ma'am. Yeah, alliance with North Korea and where that's going. So the app data thing is complicated. So I have a couple of friends who work for U.S. tech companies dealing with this kind of thing, and there are laws, and what the Chinese law says on this is that Chinese tech firms have to keep data on any sort of user operating within China. And that it can be accessed by the government for national security purposes. But it's a complete gray zone beyond that. Like in terms of what that actually means, complete gray zone. So nobody really knows what the implications are and what the actual, like how all that works in practice. But what is fair to say is that if you use like WeChat or TikTok or any of those apps, in China, your data is absolutely, kind of stored by those firms and can in some respects be accessible to the government. Outside Chinese territory, it's very complicated. It depends on a lot of different things. But I think it's not that there's zero concern, but there's also not. I don't think it's a massive concern. I also don't think it's of no concern. And in terms of North Korea, that has always been a really problematic relationship for Beijing. It's sort of like a no-lose situation. They can't give up on the alliance. They also can't. They would love to see Kim Jong-un, sort of. Well, I don't know if they would like to see him gone, but certainly being less belligerent and being less aggressive in terms of nuclear weapons, for sure. But the biggest thing there is just the economy. It's by all accounts been crushed by COVID. So nobody really knows what the situation is like there or what's going to happen in terms of as North Korea tries to recover. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. We have far more questions than we have time at this meeting, so I encourage you to stay after, and you can stay for a bit to answer those questions. That would be wonderful. I encourage you to buy Dr. Moore's book, Rethinking China's Rise. I think we would find that very fascinating. This was really, really just so sobering and very interesting to learn all of these details about our relations with China. And thank you for all that you're doing to help educate us on all of this. We have a book that we will be donating to the York Day Nursery in honor of Dr. Moore's presentation today, called Tidy by Emily Gravitt. And our speaker next week, as a reminder, is Amy Thorne from Thornhill Winery. We will have some tastings. We will have some wine here to try, and we'll also do a special toast during her presentation. We're going to learn about her unique business model and how she found a way to bring California grapes and wine making and sell it in Pennsylvania. It's a great story, so I hope that you'll be here. The investment committee will be meeting right after this meeting in the wine room right down the hall. So if you're here for that meeting, please join Matt. And in closing, a quote by Paul Harris himself: "Rotary changes us and those we serve. I believe we can change the world one life at a time." This meeting is adjourned.